Inflation is an economic plague. You can see how it has destroyed economies like Argentina, Venezuela, and Turkey, and how it has caused pain for Americans who feel prices just aren't as affordable as they used to be. In fact, most folks hate inflation so much, they would rather see unemployment rise further if it meant prices would stay put rather than see their grocery costs continue to rise. So, how did inflation rise so quickly, and when can consumers expect to catch a break? Let's bring things back a little. Prices, for the most part, have always been rising. You can see in this graphic that since the Great Depression, yearly inflation rates have seldom been negative for the year, and inflation rates are almost always up, even during the Great Recession in 2008 and COVID pandemic that began in 2020. You can see in this chart that the yearly inflation rates during these times still read positive, which means prices still increased as a whole. The reality is that the prices you see today are the lowest they will ever be, sans another Great Depression, and that has always been the case. The problem that persists today is that since April 2021, when inflation first rose above the Federal Reserve's target rate of 2% since COVID began, inflation has remained high, peaking at an astounding 9.1% in the month of June of 2022, before settling and declining back down in the months after. A lot of people blame the federal government for printing too much money during this time to give to people and businesses that were reeling from the COVID pandemic. But money printing was a smaller part of the equation, and money printing fuels inflation much worse when economic output continued to lag behind. What we saw once COVID started to wane was that the US was pulling out of the pandemic with strong economic output and growth. So most of this inflation experienced was attributed to supply chain issues from the pandemic. When businesses shut down and office buildings closed in March of 2020, demand was so low that international shipping lanes were halted, flights were suspended, and global manufacturing paused completely until people started to feel more comfortable, especially after a vaccine was rolled out. It took so long for these supply chains to restart that while consumer demand grew exponentially and unemployment rates improved, the supply for goods and services was so depleted, people were willing to pay more than ever to get things they wanted. With stimulus checks, PPP loans, jobs coming back, and higher wages, people had more money in savings than ever and were willing to pay extra for those goods and services. With COVID variants scaring suppliers every 4 months, the war in Ukraine causing oil supply to drop further, and people's demand for housing and cars causing a massive supply constraint during this time as folks left cities for suburbs and dropped the subway for a car, all this increased demand created more demand than there ever was even before the pandemic began. The growth was staggering, which was great for the US economy, the stock market, for businesses and manufacturing, but at the same time was costing US consumers. At first, wages were growing, but not as high as inflation was, and around the time inflation peaked, President Biden had signed the Inflation Reduction Act to try and combat this. No, the IRA was not a direct reason why inflation started to slow, but coincidentally, we saw around this time that the inflation rate started to decrease, and has hovered between 3 and 3.5% in recent months, which is much closer to the 2% target. However, things like housing, going out to eat, insurance costs, they've all struggled to come down as much, and people are still looking for more relief. Consumers make more than ever before and are still spending more than ever. So what can we do to fight inflation further so we can get it down to more reasonable levels? Making more money and spending more money as a cause for inflation would rightly prompt the question, well, why don't we make less and spend less? Well, the government can cut spending and raise taxes, which would effectively do both. The government has grown a lot since COVID, and in turn has spent a lot of money and has also fueled a lot of growth, which is a good thing. Unfortunately, that growth is costing consumers, as we've seen. As long as we're willing to spend, prices will continue to go up, which has forced the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates to a point where they believe the cost of lending money would be more expensive and lead to less growth, thus lower inflation. Unfortunately, growth has still not waned too much, and with the US interest rates now elevated, that means we owe more money on US debt than ever before, and it keeps rising. To combat our rising debt and stagnant inflation, we would have to raise taxes and cut spending. But based on the last few administrations, cutting spending is not very popular, because that would involve cutting or modifying crucial programs like Social Security, Medicare, defense spending, veteran spending, and much more. In fact, most of the money we spend is on social programs that people truly benefit from. So the best bet here is that we raise taxes. You raise taxes, people pay more money to the government in hopes that they use to cut down our deficit, and it suggests people would also have less money to spend on goods and services than if they were being taxed less. Things that don't help would be the opposite, like cutting taxes, increasing tariffs, canceling student loan debt, gas tax holidays, and other things that would give people more money to spend. While Americans love paying less in taxes and wouldn't mind if we tariffed Chinese goods more, these are things that would exacerbate the problem, not make them better. Tariffs are essentially like a tax that we have to pay for, and during the last administration, we started a trade war with China that included increasing tariffs on Chinese goods. Since we import a lot of Chinese goods, we enact higher tariffs so that they are more competitively priced with US goods, which can help grow manufacturing here at home. But as we know, domestic goods made in the US are more expensive. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has kept these tariffs as a way to stick it to China and not look weak. But in the end, the American people are stuck with the costs, and they're paying for this. Reshaping existing laws. In the US, we love supporting American businesses. Unfortunately, that means paying more money for goods, which, unsurprisingly, we want to do less of. The Jones Act is one of those laws that just makes no sense unless you are part of a maritime union. But outside of unions, most Americans would agree that a law like this, which prohibits any ship that was built outside of the US to transport goods between US ports, is not a good idea. With an aging US fleet and not enough mariners to assist the needs of a growing operation, this means less ships delivering goods and less supply coming into US ports, which is not good for prices when demand is as high as it is. So reshaping this law would be a good start. Increasing housing supply. What do Americans love as much as lower taxes and driving a giant pickup truck? They love their house and seeing it increase in value. What doesn't help housing increase in value is when there's more housing supply to choose from. So when new housing units are proposed to be built, especially multifamily units, many local jurisdictions will say no as to not upset their constituents, which then leads to existing housing prices being driven up to record levels as we see today, even in these high mortgage rate environments. With housing inflation being a huge driver of overall inflation rates, this is a generational level issue that needs reform on a local level more than anything. Without the push to build more housing units, whether it's an affordable housing unit, giant McMansions, or just regular townhomes, any and all options should be on the table. As we've seen, many millennials became priced out of the current housing market, and we need brave legislators to do the right things here and bring more housing legislation forward and cut red tape and not be beholden to a handful of boomers who attend every town hall meeting to stop a new housing unit from being built. Increasing immigration. A contentious issue, but an important one. Immigration has helped the US grow more than any other economy out of the pandemic, and immigrants can help lead us to lower inflationary environment as well. Right now, we have an extremely low unemployment rate, and while inflation has lowered, it remains higher than where we want it. Wages have also remained higher than inflation now for a few months, which can make it hard for certain industries to fill positions, especially like the restaurant industry, which can struggle to stay open with food prices being so high. Paying employees higher wages can run a place out of business if they don't have customers eating up that cost of the price increases. Immigrants are able to lower these costs and fill positions in need in certain industries, which can help bring prices down. And during the pandemic, immigration to the US was halted due to COVID concerns. So we've only started to see those coming into the US rise. An American worker may ask for $20 an hour to work in a factory where an immigrant may take $15, and that makes a huge difference for how prices are set. Overall, we can knock inflation down much easier with a few policy prescriptions, but Americans want less globalization and more protectionist policies. Made in America, but lower prices. More affordable groceries, but less immigration. Lower housing costs, but NIMBY policies. Sticking it to China, but cheaper electronics. You can understand why people are upset, but the issue is staring us in the mirror. And if we can't understand the issue or don't want to change our ways, then inflation can remain higher for longer. The Fed expected us to hit our target rate of 2% inflation by the end of this year, but the trend line is looking like that may have to wait until 2025.